Have you ever noticed that the more we learn about nature, the older everything has to be? Particularly when it comes to life and existence, it seems that knowledge pushes our timeline of the beginning further and further into the past. An interesting life science article showed up in my news feed entitled, "Meet Luca, the 4.2 billion year old cell that's the ancestor of all life on Earth today." When I first read that, I thought it was talking about the cell that was the first living organism on this planet, however that arose. But that's not the case. This article talks about the cell that was one of many at the time, but apparently is the only one that survived to be the last universal common ancestor of all life that exists today. All cellular life, that is. Let's take a look at this article and the research article it references to see what we can learn about our ancestors. Be sure to stop by ZazareProject.com. Here's the article where we meet our last universal common ancestor, and by universal it means on Earth, presumably. New research gives insight into when our ancestor of all living things lived, and it's earlier than we thought. Out of the gates, this is answering a when question. When is a really difficult word in today's scientific understanding. Time is a big problem, so we'll see how they arrived at this point in the past. Also, they arrived to the ancestor of all living things on Earth, and yet there were other living things as well. So that means that there was an ancestor before that. So there are more ancestors to be found, but this was the last common one before we all branched off to become different bacteria and multicellular organisms. This graphic denotes a digital representation illustrating how Luca was already under attack from viruses 4.2 billion years ago. Life was teeming just a few hundred million years after the Earth formed. The last universal common ancestor, which biologists affectionately nicknamed Luca, was it affectionately done? Because truly Luca is just an acronym that uses the first letters of each of those words, so I don't know how affectionate that is. Anyway, that ancestor wasn't so different from fairly complex bacteria alive today. So really what that says is things haven't changed that much. At least as far as bacteria go. They're either really resilient or we're really misinformed about how change works. David Pisani, a genomics researcher at the University of Bristol, commented that it's interesting and clear that this cell possessed an early immune system. This is pretty evolved by today's standards. This was actually the first time I'd heard of bacteria as having an immune system. In this biophysics and computational biology article, the authors report that some bacteria possess an adaptive immune system that maintains a memory of past viral infections. This opens the door to a far more interesting concept of memory and creating those memories. How are these cells doing it? That memory bit is fascinating. They go on to cite this mechanism, the CRISPR-Cas mechanism, which is presumably a chain of events, of molecular events inside the cell that responds to a recognized viral attack and somehow elicits this memory to create a response against it. Modern science assumes that the first protocell was some type of lipid membrane that had a bunch of proteins in it that somehow became adaptive and alive. Given that our last common ancestor 4.2 billion years ago already had a highly functional immune system, a memory, the ability to adapt to its environment, recognize threats, that doesn't create a lot of time for evolution to figure out bilayer lipid ball to turn into something that complex. All cellular life on Earth shares certain key functions. The protein building blocks, everything uses the same energy currency, which we call ATP for short. When it breaks apart, it fuels the cell's activities, and cells all use DNA, some type of genetic material, to store information. These commonalities are unlikely to be a coincidence. However, we also know that evolution tends to converge, which is to say that nature comes up with the same solutions again and again. While we think that DNA is so complex today that it has to have started with one solution, that doesn't necessarily make it so. Prior to this study, scientists estimated that the last universal common ancestor lived 3.9 billion years ago. So this is pushing it 300 million years earlier. The article this commentary is referencing is from Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Let's go see. The article was published 12 July 2024. The lead researcher is Edmund R. Moody. He's an earth science guy. The second author, Earth Science, third author, marine microbiology and biogeochemistry. The next author, paleobiology and earth sciences. Other authors represent genetics, Global Systems Institute, and that sums it up. Funders of this research included the John Templeton Foundation, whose mission is to support interdisciplinary research and catalyze conversations that inspire awe and wonder, working to create a world where people are curious about the wonders of the universe, free to pursue lives of meaning and purpose, and motivated by great and selfless love. They are into new ideas. Other funders are involved in biotechnology, biological sciences, research. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation was created to, quote, tackle large, important issues at a scale where it can achieve significant and measurable impacts. They seek durable change, value rigorous inquiry, and scientific methodology as the cornerstone of the foundation's efforts. In other words, this research is motivated by a desire to learn about the universe and explore big ideas. In any case, it's good to know who's paying to get a sense of the interests at hand. Back to the abstract, the authors comment that the age for Luca varies significantly and is a contentious topic. Some start with the notion of core metabolic functions, others try to do it from a geochemical perspective, though this study did it through a phylogenetic reconciliation. But first, this was the first time I had seen billion years denoted as GA. And I learned that in geologic time, GA means a giga-annum. We're familiar with gigabytes, but giga-annum I thought was kind of funny. That's just a sidebar. As for phylogenetics, it is the study of evolutionary relationships among biological entities, often species, individuals, or genes. So it tries to connect organisms and put them into a tree that reverse engineers their origins evolutionarily. Typically, phylogeneticists study one of the following types of question. One, what are the evolutionary relationships or histories among my species, individuals, genes of interest? Number two, how do sequences evolve? And three, can I better describe processes of sequence evolution with a mathematical model? That's interesting, because trying to describe life with math, and today's math nonetheless, what does that look like? These authors start with the idea that common ancestry is evidenced by the universal genetic code, machinery for protein synthesis, shared chirality, which means same direction of turn, and the use of ATP as a common energy currency. This combines what's called the central dogma, which is how information is transmitted from DNA to RNA to protein, which is important in biochemistry, with ATP and chirality being additional elements that are conserved and therefore to have had a common ancestor rather than having evolved multiple times under different circumstances. So Luca is the node on the tree of life from which the earliest forms of life diverged. There's a lot of debate about that early environment. Although 4.2 billion years ago, it was called the Hadean period, perhaps because it was hotter than Hades. Could the earliest bacteria have lived in that heat? Who knows? The trickier question is the ancestor of Luca had to live in even higher heat. How does that work? So let's see how they estimated the age. So it's calibrated to the oldest fossil occurrences, relaxed Bayesian node calibrated molecular clock approaches. That sounds flawless. I am by no means a statistician, but Bayes' theorem has to do with conditional probabilities. Conditional probability is the measure of the probability of an event occurring given that another event by assumption, presumption, assertion, or evidence is already known to have occurred. Wow. Assumption, presumption, and assertion have a lot of subjective qualities to it. So to say that something is already known to have happened by assumption or presumption is pretty shaky ground. That concept now has relaxed and calibrated and molecular clock approaches attached to it makes me wonder. I'm naive on this topic, but as an outsider looking in, there's a lot of room for error here. There's a lot of uncertainty here. Anyway, none of this is going to make much sense to me, honestly. So let's go for pictures. Okie dokie. This is a complicated chart, but it's not a complex one. So this is different than all my moaning and groaning about ridiculous complexity. This one has pathways that you can follow, and it looks at the time tree using these techniques to show where different species and whatnot broke off and evolved through time. So it's complicated, but it's not illogical. However, calculating these branch points moving backwards has a lot of room for error, obviously. And the authors note that. though they explain their strategy for accomplishing their estimate. Next, they estimated the physiology of LUCA. They looked at 57 phylogenetic markers in a whole bunch of prokaryotic organisms. They sorted out what's conserved, considered mutation rates, did a lot of calculations. There's a lot of assumptions in here. Whoa! Probabilistic estimates of metabolic networks from modern life that were present in LUCA. So these are all these metabolic pathways. This blue one is glycan biosynthesis and metabolism, lipid metabolism, different types of processes. These black lines are inferred to be present in LUCA, which presumably are the essential ones at the time. Interestingly, that it's superimposed on ones that exist today, which again makes me wonder, well, have they not changed that much? And why are these just add-ons to do more things or make this better? Who knows? My gut feeling is this is too complex. Certainly these processes have been observed, but that doesn't mean we understand them, how or why they work as they do. Here's our last common ancestor for all life on Earth is right here. And as you can see, there's ancestors preceding that, but there's not a lot of time for this to happen. More complex cycles involved. Here they consider LUCA's genome size and cellular features, and consider the environment and ecosystem in which it existed. In the method section, they talk about how they used universal marker genes, how these pathways were analyzed, calibrations, inference analysis, this cross-bracing approach, which I admittedly know nothing about, data parsing. So does this qualify as describing processes of sequence evolution with a mathematical model? I'm admittedly not qualified to answer that question, but I would say if that's what this is, then I really question how useful it is. Back to the Live Science article, the commentary summarizes that this research study, quote, pinpointed LUCA as living roughly 4.2 billion years ago, unquote. Well, is it pinpointed or is it roughly? They did not expect LUCA to be so old because the Earth was so young. However, they extend that to the idea that life may be flourishing in Earth-like biospheres elsewhere in the universe. Sure, why not? I've had a couple of thoughts on reading this article. The first is, we don't seem to understand time that well. What does seem to happen is the more we learn, the more we think we can just push the timeline out. We see that more a function of our knowledge than a function of our perception of how time works. When we think things are random, you need big timelines to explain why things are as complex as they are today, especially when it comes to life. Also, the time interval between a protocell and the last universal common ancestor is really quite close together in geologic time. If that ancestor was 4.2 billion years ago and humans only evolved in the last several million years, then it would appear that evolution drastically slowed down, or that there was some type of tipping point. Perhaps single-cell organisms persisted for most of history, then something changed to allow them to become multicellular organisms, a big question we don't really have the answer to today. I thought about the comment that really ancient bacteria look fairly similar to today, and I thought the same thing about humans too. When we look back to humanoids, however far back you go, well, they all kind of did the same thing that we do now. They had to secure a food supply. They eventually learned to cook it and to grow it, and they needed shelter and to take care of their young. While today we use automobiles, the internet, and think our big frontal lobes are so great, fundamentally, are we really that different than our humanoid ancestors? The final takeaway is trying to mathematize life when we don't understand what life is sketchy territory. It's pigeonholing life into equations in a way that is probably more misleading than helpful. But anyway, it's been a really interesting exploration, and thanks for joining me. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and leave your comments below. See you soon.